So we've been studying the Song of Solomon. Anybody read it yet? And see, now that scared me. I do see some hands. Okay, that's good. All right, that's making me feel a little bit better. The challenge, week one, was to read the Song of Solomon, to read the book. It's not too many chapters. It's not a hard read, but it is maybe a little bit of a tough one to figure out, to understand all that is going on. And so that's why we're walking through it. We took our first week to look at deepening our desire. Last week we talked about intimacy and increasing intimacy in our relationships. And today we look at fighting fair. Interesting one, huh? We've been talking about some of the characteristics of marriage as we've walked through this in previous weeks. And really, marriage should be, as we saw in the movie, as the movie that we saw depicts, is that marriage should be a song. It should be a beautiful song. What we do in marriage, what our marriage looks like, what our marriage sounds like, should be a beautiful song. So often it isn't, but it can be. It should be a song that inspires us, and I wonder this morning if that's the kind of relationship that you desire. Whether you are married today, whether you are looking at being married someday, or whether you just want a relationship with family and friends that is harmonious and beautiful, I wonder, are you ready to take some of those steps? Because today sort of marks the halfway point of this series that we've been going through, and it's going to be important for us to kind of take stock at the end of today, to step back just a little bit and understand a little bit about what God is doing, what God is saying to us in our lives. As we've shared and as we've talked about in these last couple of weeks, this is somewhat of a unique book. Along the way, we have seen some very beautiful, some poetic language, a lot of stunning descriptions, a lot of emotion, passion, and beautiful love. To be quite honest, it's very much real life. That's what we've seen here. Even though it's depicted in a certain way, it's depicted very much what I would consider to be sort of in a Bible kind of way. It really does speak very much about real life, what a real relationship looks like and what it can be. Song of Solomon, as we've learned here, doesn't pull any punches. Song of Solomon really goes to the heart of romance, goes to the heart of marriage, goes to the heart of intimacy. And I think that one of the things that the Song of Solomon pulls no punches about, that we're going to take a look at today, is conflict. It doesn't always seem very biblical, but sure enough, here in the Song of Solomon, we see conflict. In Song of Solomon chapter 5, just shortly after the wedding ceremony and the honeymoon that we looked at last week, this couple is already experiencing some conflict. So let's pick it up. Let's take a look at it. Come with me to chapter 5, verses 2 through 8. That's chapter 5, verses 2 through 8. There we go. I slept, but my heart was awake. Listen, my beloved is knocking. Open to me, my sister, my darling, my dove, my flawless one. My head is drenched with dew, my hair with the dampness of the night. I have taken off my robe. Must I put it on again? I have washed my feet. Must I soil them again? My beloved thrust his hand through the latch, opening. My heart began to pound for him. I arose to open for my beloved, and my hands dripped with myrrh, my fingers with flowing myrrh. On the handles of the bolt, I opened for my beloved, but my beloved had left. He was gone. My heart sank at his departure. I looked for him, but I did not find him. I called for him, but he did not answer. The watchman found me, and as they made their rounds in the city, they beat me, they bruised me. They took away my cloak, those watchmen of the walls. Daughters of Jerusalem, I charge you, if you find my beloved, what will you tell him? Tell him, I am faint with love. We can't be entirely sure What produced conflict here? We don't really see that. We don't really read that. We don't really know from this scripture what produced the conflict. He was knocking at the door. She was late in opening it. When she did, he was gone and she couldn't find him. That's what we read in the scripture. I don't know what caused it, but she obviously is distressed about it. But without trying to read too much into this text, let's understand a few things about conflict in marriage. This is what I really want us to home in on today, is understand a few things about conflict in marriage. Very often, here's your first thing, it's flat silly. Anybody with me? Very often we don't know what happened. We don't know really what happened in these verses to make him leave and for her to be so worried, but it doesn't seem like much. And I wonder if you can attest to the fact that so many times when conflict arises in our marriages, even in any kind of relationship, so often it's over the silliest of things. The most minor of things. I don't know how many times in church I have seen people leave a church over the silliest little stuff because they failed to work it out. They failed to even talk about it. They failed to even acknowledge it between each other. And as a result, conflict arises and all of a sudden things come to an end. The other thing to understand about some of this silly stuff is it hurts more than we can possibly imagine. The reality is that when we let this silly stuff get in the way of us, the littlest things can become the biggest things in the world, and they begin to really hurt. Why do they hurt? Because in a marital relationship, we're married, or should be, to our best friend, our closest confidant. Even the littlest of things can cause our love to be stretched. But there's something else that we need to see here. Sometimes we overreact. Anybody ever overreacted? I'm just waiting for you to realize that you do. Okay, just take your time. I've got all day. Anybody ever overreacted? Yeah. Now you're just saying yes, so I'll move on. I get it. I understand. I think we all overreact at times, don't we? Overreaction in a marital conflict leads to even bigger problems. Maybe it's because we feel safe in a committed marriage that we just kind of let loose this unfettered kind of anger and this sarcasm, and we just stop firing ammunition because we know this person so intimately that we just stop firing all kinds of stuff at them. I wonder if you've ever been in a conflict like that because we have overreacted. There's a few things I think we get from Song of Solomon chapter 5. Every marriage has conflict. I once heard a preacher, and he talked about how him and his wife had been married for 20-something years, and they had never, ever had a crossword. Never disagreed. I can't say that he wasn't telling the truth. Not my place, not in that marriage. But I would say that just about every marriage has some kind of conflict in it. Is anybody with me in that? We go through conflict. Every one of us. It's reality. When you're talking about two human beings who are flawed, who struggle from day to day, the realities are that we have conflict in our marriages from time to time. There's some differences, though, in how we deal with it, how we face it, how we address it. And that's what we're going to really kind of home in on. That's what we're really going to take a look at today and understand how it is that we should address these things. The first thing that I want us to make sure that we understand here is that we have to be committed to the relationship. That's the first thing I want us to see and hear here, because our spouses, and even if it's not a marital relationship, even if we're talking about parents and their kids, if we're talking about brothers and sisters, we have to be able to trust one another that we are committed to this. See, here's the problem. In the society in which we're living in, marriage particularly has become so incredibly disposable, and realistically, just about every relationship has become so incredibly disposable that we throw it away all too quickly. It's all too easy just to say, you know what, I don't have to put up with this junk, I'm out of here. Anybody ever heard those words? Anybody ever said those words? Wow, I was quite surprised. I was expecting it to go really quiet just then. It's really easy to walk away. As my wife and I have spent many hours with couples over at the time of our ministry, one of the things that we have talked about early on is the reality that the really easy thing is just to say, you know what, let's just end this. Let's just end the pain for each other and let's just walk away. We need to know from each other that we are committed to this. The only way we resolve conflict very quickly, very clearly, very easily, and without damage is for each other to know, I am committed here. Anybody with me in that? We have to be willing to acknowledge, I am committed here. In fact, it has to be more than just words. It has to go into action where we demonstrate that we are committed here in the relationship. You're probably thinking, well, if I'm in a marriage, then I'm already committed. And I would say that doesn't mean a thing in reality unless our heart and our mindset is, I am committed here. That has to be our mindset. That has to be our heart. What does that really mean for us, though? Having conflict or disagreement in marriage or in any relationship, realistically, is okay. As long as we are clear with each other, as long as we are open with each other, as long as we are very direct with each other, that we are committed to one another. The other thing that we have to realize, the other thing that we have to acknowledge here is that we're not committed to ourselves. We're committed to that person. We're committed to that relationship. And you see, here's where we get messed up, and here's where we get off track with what we're really supposed to be, and that is Christ-like beings, right? Every one of us should have a desire to be Christ-like. We should have a desire to be becoming closer and closer with Jesus Christ, and that means to become like Jesus Christ. And as we walk on that path, becoming like Jesus Christ, getting closer and closer to being like Him, then there's a thing called humility that has to step in. If we look in 1 Corinthians 13, we've read it many times in this church because we've talked a lot about love over time, but it must be a reoccurring reality that we need to keep talking about it because we seem to forget this stuff, that love is so much more about the other person than ourselves. And when we get that right, then it's amazing how things start to work in a relationship. When we get that right in a marriage, it's amazing how the marriage seems to work when that partner recognizes, I'm not committed to myself, I'm committed to you. I'm committed to this union. I'm committed to this relationship. I'm committed to this relationship not till it gets so hard that I want to leave, but I'm committed to this relationship until I'm going to stay here and I'm going to work through everything that I need to because I love you. Not just words, oh, I love you, but I love you. Committed to the good of our relationship, committed to the good of the other person, not ourselves. If your spouse or the person you are in conflict with knows that you care more about the marriage or the relationship than about being right, it changes the tone of the conflict, doesn't it? I'm going to say that again because I want to make sure that we hear that. I want to make sure that we sort of absorb that into our brain. When the person that we're in conflict with recognizes that we care more about the relationship than we do about being right, it transforms conflict dramatically. That's the demonstration, you see, that we're committed to the relationship rather than committed to making ourselves happy. If you care more about the marriage than about being right, it not only helps the conflict come to an end, but actually going to reduce the amount of conflict we have within that marriage. In Ephesians chapter 5, in Paul's famous passage on marriage, he says that husbands need to love their wives just as Christ loved the church. Now notice I said that part first because I wanted men to hear that part first. He says to the husbands, love your wives, that you need to love your wives just as Christ loved the church. That raises the bar a little bit, doesn't it, gentlemen? It raises the bar a little bit when we are to love our wives just as Christ loved the church. And he says, wives, submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. Not to submit to your husbands because he's the manly man and he says how it's going to be. But submit to your husbands as unto the Lord. It does not mean that wives obey and give in to every single thing the husband does. It does mean that the two responsibilities have to work hand in hand. You see, it's a union. It's a partnership. It's one working with the other. The wife submits to the husband because he loves her in a Christ-like way. The husband loves his wife because he knows she's willing to submit to his desires to what will make the marriage succeed. The two have to work in tandem. You see, it's a partnership. And this goes in any kind of relationship. Not just in marital relationships. When we look at our relationships with brothers and sisters and maybe mothers and daughters or maybe the kids, whatever it might be. You see, when we begin to put these principles into place in our relationships, in all our relationships, it's amazing how much conflict diminishes, and it's amazing how much conflict becomes less damaging. Paul said that all Christians should submit to one another out of reverence for Christ. To submit to one another. Imagine a church where there is no ego. Think about it for a second. Imagine a church where there is no ego. I didn't say where there was no leadership, but where there is no ego. When we're not letting our own agendas get in the way of decision making. When we're not letting our own aspirations of being a leader or being in charge of a study group or being in charge of this get in front of what God desires for that ministry. Imagine that ministry. I believe we're on the way because we have preached and taught this from the very day we began. And let me tell you, if you're tired of it, I was going to say sorry, but I'm not. Because we're going to continue teaching that in this church, in this ministry. Because when we get that right, this will be and will continue to be the most beautiful place on earth. Just as many other churches are. That wasn't sounding boastful above other churches. The same principle that guides all Christians in interacting with one another to submitting to one another in order to glorify Christ applies to husbands and to wives, interacting with each other, to submitting to each other out of desire to make their marriage succeed. I have a question that I'm asked to ask you this morning. What would change in the way you handle conflict if your spouse or any relationship you're in, if you truly cared more about the health and the thriving of your marriage or that relationship than about getting your way? What would change in the way that you handle your relationship if you cared more about having a healthy and thriving relationship than about getting your way? I want you to really reflect on that for a moment. It's gone really deathly quiet because I think maybe we are cutting to the quick here, because whether we want to admit it or not, there are probably more in this room this morning that are struggling with this than are willing to necessarily raise their hands and admit it. If you haven't struggled with it in the past, you may struggle with it in the future. You may be struggling with it right now. But I want you to just to resonate with that question. What would change in the way you handle conflict if you and the person that you're in the closest relationship with cared more about the health and a thriving relationship than about getting your way? Answer that question honestly in your heart. Don't point fingers at somebody else. Just answer that question honestly in your heart. It's not about what somebody else would do differently, you see. Here's the point. It's about what you would do differently. It causes us to challenge, what would I have to do differently in order for that to work? If we agree on those terms of engagement as we go into relationship, it begins to change everything. Now, I want to be clear. Abuse in any form is not okay. It must never go unnoticed, and it must never go unmentioned. I do have to say this morning. If you are in an abusive relationship, please don't keep quiet. We must pursue good in your relationship. We must. And it needs to be brought to light. The second key in dealing with conflict, as the person that we're in relationship with recognizes the need for us to be utterly committed. As we utterly commit ourselves to that relationship, as the person we're in relationship with knows 100%, this person is committed to this. I know it. I can guarantee it. I could put money on it. The second key I want to challenge you to consider is a very simple one. It's the one you're going to shake your head at, and you're going to go, it really can't be that simple. But the second key in fighting fair in a marriage is to apologize first. Resonate on that for a second. Apologize first. If both of you are so quick to apologize first, boy, things end really quickly, don't they? It's amazing how fast that conflict will be over when both of you recognize, hey, I need to apologize to you. I'm wrong. Sometimes the apology is over very big things. Sometimes the apology needs to be over the very simplest things. We've already said that overreaction sometimes kind of gets in the middle of a relationship. And I think one of the biggest reasons is that we begin to bottle stuff up. We hold stuff in. Instead of letting it go, instead of releasing it, instead of getting the stuff off of our chest, we just hold it in until we explode over the very last straw. There are one or two things that my wife does that bother me. Who's going to be the first go teller? I'll be watching. They like to rat me out. That's what they like to do. Now, of course, because my wife is so perfect, there's only one or two things. Now, there's a lot more things about me that bother her, I'm sure. A lot more things. In fact, probably a ton of things if I'm real. But that's just life of a human being, isn't it? We have those little idiosyncrasies, those little things that we do that just, like kind of going down a chalkboard with the fingernails. But over time, I got to tell you, I've come to realize that those little things that may bug me here and there, they pale into insignificance in the love that my wife brings to our relationship, in the forgiveness for my little stuff that my wife brings to the relationship. The way I think we should handle conflict is to be Christ-like. You see, we go back to this element of humility and Christ-likeness where we're willing to say, I'm wrong. I can't just tell her how she needs to deal with stuff. I can't just hope that she doesn't notice that stuff in me. I can't just keep hoping that we're just going to go through life and she doesn't realize X, Y, and Z. I have to be Christ-like. I have to humble myself before my wife and let her know I'm sorry for those little things and work on being more Christ-like. Man, that's not easy, is it? Because we have this thing called pride. This kind of manly attitude that we couldn't possibly be wrong. Woman wrong, man right. Yeah. Let's wake up and be Christ-like, shall we? Sometimes, again, those little things become the big things. Pursuing the good in marriage means that we have to be more concerned about what's good for the marriage and be willing to acknowledge when we're wrong. Be willing to acknowledge and say sorry first. Not waiting until we get caught in an argument, not waiting until we're trying to win the argument, and not trying to bring up the past, but being willing to say those ultimately most powerful two words we could possibly say, I'm sorry. It would save a lot of headache, a lot of loneliness, a lot of stress, and a lot of anger. Song of Solomon, chapter 5, verse 8. This woman is looking for her husband. She couldn't find him to make things right with him. And she said, that she was faint with love. Isn't that what happens when we aren't right in our marriage? I want you to think about that, because when we're not right in our marriage, when we're not right in certain relationships in our lives, it becomes incredibly stressful. It becomes incredibly exhausting, and we become faint with love. Absolutely exhausted by the relationship. We choose, realistically, at that point, to live with bitterness. We live trying to win arguments. We live trying to pursue our own desires. And we create an environment in our relationships, in our marriages, that is nothing but stress, anxiety, unrest, anger, and bitterness. Faint with love, as we read in Song of Solomon. It takes a lot of courage and humility to apologize first. But it takes an even bigger toll on our hearts and on our relationships when we're too selfish to do it. The last point I want us to see here, you're really truly going to say, I did not get my money's worth. You're going to sit there and say, I had to listen to this whole message for him to say that at the end. So here we go. I'm going to have to say it. Are you ready for this? This is going to transform your relationship forever and ever. Be nice to each other. Sounds ridiculous, doesn't it? Sounds way too easy. It sounds like it possibly couldn't be true, but here's the thing. We got to be nice to each other. In our marriages, husbands, you got to be nice to your wife. Ladies, you got to be nice to your husbands. Brothers, you got to be nice to your sisters. Sisters, you got to be nice to your brothers. Moms, you got to be nice to your daughters. Daughters, you got to be nice to your moms. There's a few moms in here saying, why are my kids not in here listening to this? I know it sounds like you are not getting your money's worth here, but let's just think about this for a second. When you fight with your best friend, what is your tone like? When you fight with the person that you love the most, now remember, I didn't say what was their tone like. What is your tone like? How do you talk to them? What kind of words do you use when you're in conflict? Do you use words of edification, or do you use words that just demeanor and blow and beat down? Do you belittle them? Either explicitly or in just these minor, subtle ways? Do you use sarcasm with them? Do you raise your voice? Parents, as we sit here in this room, I'm sure those things resonate with you in some form. See, it's not as simple as it sounds when we first started out. When you first heard me say, be nice to each other, it sounded so simple, yet realistically, it's probably one of the things that we struggle with the most in our relationships, particularly with the people that we love the most, because we think we can get away with stuff that we absolutely shouldn't. I'm convinced that a lot of big problems in our fights, in marriages, stem from small, easily handled discussions that blow up because we fail to be nice to each other. Take a moment to reflect on maybe some arguments, some conflict that you have had in the last few months, and you might to be able to relate. It makes a difference. Who says that we have to, in disagreement, raise our voices? Who says that we have to make the other person feel bad? Who says we have to end up on top? Who says it's okay to hurt each other's feelings? It doesn't have to be that way. Paul wrote in Galatians 5:22 and 23. We're going to see these words come up on the screen. Galatians 5:22 and 23. We read about the fruit of the Spirit. In fact, if you have been in our couples group, this is something that we're really homing in on and will continue to home in on over these weeks. Can we go back to verse 22? There we go. But of the fruit of the Spirit is love, joy, peace, forbearance, which is patience, kindness, goodness, and gentleness. Gentleness and self-control. Against such things there is no law. We have to use these things to filter our disagreements. You see, this is what it truly means from Scripture to be nice. if we use the fruit of the Spirit to filter our disagreements, then it begins to change things really quickly, doesn't it? I think we'd be amazed at how much less tense disagreements would be if we were to use Galatians 5:22 and 23 as the filter for every disagreement. If we can agree to pursue good in our relationship and not our own selfish desires, if we can humble ourselves to be first to apologize, if we can truly be nice and kind and gentle and self-controlled when we speak, conflict with the very closest relationships we have will change drastically. Amen? Here's why it matters so much. This isn't some kind of self-help stuff, right? This isn't, I didn't preface this by this will lead you to a happier life. This is about having a godly relationship, about disagreeing in a fair and appropriate, godly way. We won't always see eye to eye. We won't always agree on everything. But I have to tell you, marriage is not about you. Marriage is not even really, truly about happiness. It's not about self-fulfillment. It's about learning to sacrifice. It's about learning to be selfless. It's about learning to serve one another and learning to be humble. Being happy is a natural outpouring of all of those things. You see, we have to get those priorities right in marriage or in any relationship we're engaged in. I want to ask you to take a moment with me. We got to act like Jesus. I don't mean act as in perform and put on a show. We've got to be Christ-like. You may say, that's impossible. I'm never going to accomplish that. Shouldn't we try? Shouldn't we work daily to be closer to Him, to be more like Him in our marriages, in our relationships, in our day-to-day walk, when we're at work, when we're at school, no matter where we are? You see, marriage should be a beautiful song, a thing of absolute beauty. Anybody ever watch Dancing with the Stars? Anybody ever watch that show? A few of you are willing to admit it. You know, when you watch those shows, when they get it right, it's a thing of beauty, isn't it? When they get it wrong, it's just painful. When they get it wrong, you're just kind of like, oh, that's horrible. Oh, that's just awful. Oh, look at the way he stepped on her toe. Oh, he should have caught her when they did that. Oh, she should have done that. Realistically, that's kind of like watching a marriage that isn't a Christ-like marriage. Stumbling all over the place. Tripping all over the place. Stepping on each other's toes. Missing the cues. Not communicating clearly. A marriage that is a Christ-like marriage. A relationship that is a Christ-like relationship is a thing of absolute beauty to watch. It's the kind of thing you could just sit back and just look at all day and go, that's beautiful. That's amazing. Oh, that's great. Oh, good job. Choice is for you. What do you want? Maybe your relationships got off to a rocky start. Maybe, as we looked at last week, you've struggled to get the intimacy part right. Maybe you just simply haven't been reflecting Christ in your relationships. Maybe today it's time for a mid-course correction. We're halfway through this series. I went to the dentist this week. I'm doing Invisalign, that thing that instead of wearing braces, it kind of gets your teeth better and looking straighter. I hope you've looked at me lately and go, wow, Captain's teeth are looking straight. No, you haven't. It's okay. It's all right. I really wasn't waiting for a reaction. It was like, oh, yeah, I was thinking that the other day. I really wasn't anticipating that. But this week, I'm halfway through. It was time for a mid-course correction. Things weren't tracking quite the way that they needed to, so they had to take some new molds and they had to get it right, and I got to kind of refocus and get this thing right so we can finish out the course. Maybe we need to do that today. A mid-course correction. Maybe in your marriages, maybe in your relationships, it's time to stop and say, you know, I have not been getting this right. Not she hasn't been getting this right. Or not he has not been doing this right. But I have not been getting this right. Maybe today it's time for that mid-course correction. Because it's not too late. We sung about grace. We sung about the freedom that comes in a relationship with Jesus Christ today. It's in this place. Maybe it's time for you to take a mid-course correction. I'm going to ask Tim